We love because he first loved us. That's short, to the point. We love because he first loved us. With a whole lot of implications. What is the practice of radical hospitality? The personal practice of radical hospitality begins and ends and continues with a receiving, a perceiving, a listening, and an opening and accepting attitude. A readiness to accept and welcome the God who reaches out to us first. It's sustained by active behaviors that put us in the most advantageous places to continue to welcome God in Christ. It includes habits that transform us as we regularly, frequently, and intentionally make room for God in our lives. That's what we determined hospitality was, making room in our lives for other people, and in this case, making room in our lives for God. God's love isn't something that we have to strive for, or earn, or work on, or fear. It's something God freely gives. We're loved first, finally, and forever by God, with a love so deep and profound and significant that God offers his Son to signify and solidify this love forever so that we get it. Let me say that again. God's love is a love so deep and profound and significant that God offers his Son to signify and solidify this love forever so that we get it. The journey to becoming what God would have us to be, begins with opening ourselves to this kind of love and giving it a place in our hearts. This welcoming requires of us an extraordinary hospitality, a radical receptivity, a willingness to allow God to come in and dwell in our hearts. Friends, open the doors of your heart to God. But there are 14,000 obstacles that prevent our receiving God's love and make us inhospitable to God reaching out to us. There are all sorts of distractions and defenses that we put up that close the door to God's love. There are other voices in our world repeating to us different messages than what I'm telling you today. Our commercial culture, as an example, repeats over and over through the TV and radio and magazines and billboards and internet and iPods, all penetrating into our lives what the world thinks it takes to make us happy. They replay the myth that a good life comes from the practice of what? Buying, possessing, and accumulating. That's the practice our commercial culture constantly tries to drive into our heads. And as soon as we accept that, we're closing our hearts to God. For our faith teaches that life abundant and fruitful comes from deeper sources than that. As we look at our world around us as well, the rapid speed and intensity of our high-tech and highly mobile lifestyles distracts us from fathoming the spiritual life and the depth of God's love for us. We simply don't have time to give to God's love reaching out to us, to build any sort of a depth. We live on the surface of life because of the speed at which we try to live it, the speed at which we try to keep up with the world around us. For many of us, every moment of every waking day is filled with movement, and activity and noise, which leads to a rather shallow and surface existence. But our faith teaches us that God is in the depth, and we lose touch with God when we focus only on surface things. Our faith teaches us that God is in the silence, which we tend to neglect and fear. Our faith teaches us that God is in the questions that arise when we break free from distractions. Our faith teaches us that God is in the mystery when we learn there's more to living than what we can see and touch and explain and possess. Our faith teaches us that God is in the discovery and the exploration of our inner selves. All of these things we discover when we open our lives to God. There are other distractions and defenses that get in the way, that close our hearts to God, not only in the world around us, but in ourselves. There are internal pressures that complicate receiving God's love. How many of you have negative voices from your past that play in your heads, that replay through your minds, that remind you of the struggles that you've had in your life, maybe that you haven't yet overcome, or maybe you've yearned for the affirmation of parents or other loved ones, and you've not received that love. Maybe you've had unresolved personal issues that keep coming up. These kinds of negative voices block our ability to receive the true unconditional love that comes from God. All of us have a history, and we've made destructive decisions that create in us reservoirs of shame and guilt and regret. And these kinds of things continue to influence the way we behave, the way we think, the way we make choices, and they continue to close our openness toward God. Clinging to life as we've come to live it, even if it feels unsatisfying, seems easier than change. These things, our commercial culture, the high-speed lifestyle with which we live, the negative voices, and these reservoirs of shame and guilt and regret, cut us off from the good and fruitful life that Jesus wants for us. They keep us closed to grace. And the door we've been closing on God's grace has been shutting us off from that which we need the most. Is there a way out? A way through these obstacles to the life that God intends for us? How can we live fruitfully and happily and meaningfully in the face of these recurring obstacles that separate us from God? That's where the practice of radical hospitality comes in. What is practicing radical hospitality toward God? How do we do it?